FPS matters less than you think in Tarkov. And before you click off, I'm not saying FPS doesn't matter. I'm saying Tarkov isn't a fast-paced shooter. And because of that, raw FPS isn't what decides most fights. What actually decides them is consistency, positioning, and how predictable the game feels in the moment. So, if you ever upgraded your PC and thought, this feels better, but I'm not suddenly winning everything, this video is about why that makes sense. Every wipe, the same argument comes back. One group says high FPS changed everything for them. Another says they played thousands of hours below 60 and fine. Tarkov's performance is rough, and its optimization absolutely makes FPS problems more noticeable than in most games. But the reason these arguments never go anywhere is because FPS complaints in Tarkov are real. They just don't always translate into how fights are actually decided. The problem is that we use FPS to describe everything. Smoothness, input delay, stutters, even desync. But FPS is just an average, and averages don't describe how Tarkov actually feels moment to moment. What matters more is consistency, and that's where frame time and 1% lows come in. So, let's separate things for a second. FPS tells you how many frames you get on average. Frame time tells you how long each individual frame takes to appear. If every frame takes about the same amount of time, the game feels smooth. If one frame suddenly takes much longer, that's when you feel a hitch or a stutter. Even if your FPS counter looks fine, a single bad frame can throw off your aim, your timing, or how confident you feel taking a shot. Think of it like driving. Your average speed can be fine, but if the road suddenly has potholes, the ride still feels awful. Tarkov is especially sensitive to this, because so much happens at once. Like AI spawning, audio updates, scope rendering, and inventory checks. Those things don't lower your FPS evenly, they cause sudden spikes. And those spikes while 1% lows are actually measuring. So, what are 1% lows? 1% lows are a way of measuring the worst moments in your performance. Instead of asking, how fast is the game on average, 1% lows ask, how bad does it get, even briefly? That's important because most fights don't happen during average moments. They happen during transitions. When you scope in, when you swing a corner, or when AI spawns. If your 1% lows are bad, those moments feel delayed, inconsistent, or just wrong. Even if your FPS counter says everything is fine. Now this is why Tarkov can feel okay for minutes at a time, and then suddenly feel awful during a fight. It's not that your FPS dropped across the whole raid. It's that the worst 1% of frames happen at the worst possible time. You don't need to understand the exact numbers to feel this. You feel when a shot doesn't line up, when a peek feels late, or when you hesitate without knowing why. That's what people usually mean when they say Tarkov feels inconsistent. So when you put frame time and 1% lows together, you start to see why FPS by itself doesn't explain much in Tarkov. So here's where frame time and 1% lows come together. Frame time tells you how smooth the game is moment to moment. 1% lows tell you how bad the worst moments get. When both of those are stable, the game feels predictable. Your input lines up with what you see, you trust your timing. When they're not, something subtle happens. You don't just miss shots, you start hesitating. You second guess peaks, you hold angles longer than you should. You stop committing to fights you would normally take. Not because your aim got worse, but because the game stopped feeling reliable. Tarkov punishes hesitation more than bad aim. If you're late on a swing, you're dead. If you pause mid-peak, you're dead. So when frame spikes happen during those moments, they don't just affect performance, they change how you play. This is why people say higher FPS made them better. What actually happened is the game became more predictable. Their decisions didn't change, their confidence did. That's also why chasing a higher peak FPS doesn't always help. If your average goes up, but your worst moments stay bad, the game still feels unreliable. Lower, stable performance often feels better than higher, unstable performance. And this matters even more in Tarkov, because the game doesn't force you to rely on raw reaction speed. Tarkov has never forced you to play fast. In games like Counter-Strike, Valorant, Apex or Fortnite, fights are decided almost entirely by reaction speed and precision. You see someone, you flick, you track, and higher FPS directly helps you win that exchange. Tarkov isn't built like that. Most Tarkov fights are decided before the first shot. By positioning, by timing, or by who heard who first. If you know where someone is coming from, you don't need perfect frames to win that fight. And because of that, Tarkov gives you ways to reduce how much performance matters. You can hold angles instead of swinging, you can slow fights down instead of forcing them, or you can disengage instead of committing. All of those lower how much raw FPS and reaction speed decide the outcome. In fast-paced shooters, higher FPS raises your ceiling. In Tarkov, it mostly raises your comfort, reaching the same ceiling. That's why the impact feels so different. So instead of asking how to squeeze out more FPS, the better question in Tarkov is how to avoid situations where performance matters the most. So, what does all of this actually mean when you're playing Tarkov? It means FPS is something you should be aware of, but it shouldn't be the thing you fixate on. Tarkov isn't a game where you optimize until everything feels perfect. That state basically doesn't exist. The goal isn't to make Tarkov smooth. The goal is to make it predictable. If your performance is inconsistent, the first question shouldn't be, how do I get more FPS? It should be, when does the game feel worst, and why? Is it when you scope in? When AI spawns? Or when you push into a dense area? Those moments are where frame time spikes and bad 1% lows show up. And those are the moments you should be playing around. Not avoiding fights entirely, but choosing how and when you take them. If your system struggles during fast swings, don't force them. Hold angles, let people walk into you. If scopes tank your performance, reposition before you ADS. Slow the engagement down. That's not playing scared, that's playing within the game's limits. Now, this isn't about compensating for bad hardware. Even high-end systems hit performance spikes in Tarkov. But understanding when performance matters lets you avoid blaming the wrong thing. A lot of players wait for better performance before they trust their decisions. In Tarkov, it works better the other way around. If you make good decisions consistently, performance issues become something you can manage, not something that defines every fight. That's why FPS matters in Tarkov, just not in the way most people expect. Now, there's one more reason FPS complaints are so loud in Tarkov, and it has less to do with performance numbers and more to do with how the game makes you feel. Tarkov is a high-stakes game. Death isn't just a reset, it's lost time, lost gear, and lost momentum. So when something goes wrong, your brain immediately looks for a reason. Now, a frame hitch during a gunfight feels way worse than a hitch while running through a field, but not because it's technically worse, but because it happens at the exact moment you care most. To keep it simple, you remember the bad moments more clearly than the average ones. You don't remember the 5 raids that felt fine, you remember the 1 death that felt really off. Now that's not a Tarkov problem, that's just how people work. Tarkov amplifies that feeling because fights are rare, slow, and meaningful. In a fast shooter you die and you're back in 10 seconds. In Tarkov you might spend 30 minutes setting up one fight. So, when performance spikes ruin that moment, it feels catastrophic. That frustration is valid. The performance problems are real, but feeling bad doesn't always mean the problem decided the fight. Most of the time, what performance issues do is break your confidence, and once confidence is gone, decision making suffers. That's why understanding what performance actually affects is so important. Because once you separate how Tarkov feels from how Tarkov actually plays, the whole FPS debate starts to make more sense. So, when people argue about FPS in Tarkov, they're not really disagreeing about performance. They're disagreeing about what they felt in a few critical moments. FPS, frame time, and 1% lows all matter. Tarkov's optimization makes performance issues more noticeable than they should be. But Tarkov is not a fast-paced shooter, and because of that, performance rarely decides fights on its own. What decides those fights is positioning, timing, information, and decisions made before the first shot. Performance issues don't usually change what happened, they change how confident you felt while it happened. Performance issues don't usually change what happened, they change how confident you felt while it happened. That's why some players upgrade their PC and feel a massive difference, and why others play for years on lower FPS and still succeed. And why others play for years on lower FPS and still succeed. They weren't wrong, they were just experiencing different parts of the same system. Tarkov will probably never feel perfectly smooth. And waiting for that before playing, well, it's a losing game. Understanding what performance actually affects lets you stop fighting the wrong problem. FPS matters in Tarkov, just not in the way most people think.